everyone. It is Bible 365 with Kathy Carter, and today is day 51, and we are reading Leviticus 12 through 14 today. Today is, we're moving on in the book of Leviticus. If you have never been with me before, I would love if you went back actually to the book of Exodus. I don't feel like Leviticus is a really great place to start, so go back to the book of Exodus. At least if you can go all the way back to the book of Genesis. We are reading through the Bible chronologically, and I'm just sharing my thoughts with you, sharing what I believe that God is saying, who God is, and who the people are in these, in what God has written in the book that we call the Bible. So the chronological reading plan is called the 1 Year Chronological Bible online. And so you can grab that online and you can download the free printable reading plan, or you can buy one of their Bibles. So any of those things are open to you. We are in the book of Leviticus, which is the book discussing what the Levites will be doing in the temple. So in the tabernacle. So there are a couple different names: tent of meeting, tabernacle. This is a place where they have the Israelites who were saved out of slavery. They have built this area for the priests to go in and to dwell in and to speak to God, and then to accept offerings for sins, offerings for wave offerings, offerings for thankfulness, offerings for their first fruits and things like that. So this whole thing is set up in order for the priests to sacrifice to God when the Israelites either go wrong or go right. There are other ways that they can come in and make offerings as well. But right now, God is speaking. So God comes down and speaks inside the tent of meeting, and he speaks through these two cherubim in this Ark of the Covenant that was built. And he speaks to Moses and he speaks to Aaron sometimes. So it just depends. I think in these chapters, we see he goes both ways. Sometimes he speaks to Moses, and then sometimes he speaks to both of them. And then they go and they let the people know what the law or the rule is. And then when it's found that maybe the law has been broken, or something different about that law, then they will come and make an offering, and they explain what the offering is. So today, we are in the chapter. So we start in chapter 12, and this is the chapter where it's talking about women and childbirth. And so I'm going to start with the beginning, because that's what I always kind of like to start with verse 1, so we can see what's going on. In verse 1, it's the Lord says to Moses, say to the Israelites, a woman who becomes pregnant and gives birth. So we start talking about that. So here's the basic idea of it. So a woman becomes pregnant, she gives birth, and if it is a son, she has certain things that she has to do, and if it is a daughter, she has certain other things that she has to do. So these are statutes that take place for eternity, right? Ad nauseum. So he's giving this originally, but this is something to be followed for future generations. And so one of the things is if it is a boy, the woman, and I'm going to give both of these because it depends if it's a girl or a boy. If it's a boy, it's 7 days. If it's a boy, or if it's a girl, it's 2 weeks. So it's sort of like doubling what a woman has to do if it's a girl. It's one number if it's a boy, and it's doubling it if it's a girl. And what the deal is she's considered ceremonially unclean. And so she's unclean for a short period of time. She is not overall considered unclean, but she is considered ceremonially unclean. And so when she comes back from her uncleanliness, then she would give an offering. So I want to be clear, because we're going to find there are some differences coming in the next chapter. It seems like when you're ceremonially unclean, so when they use that term ceremonial, a ceremony needs to be performed in order to then call you clean. And so it seems like it's short term for a certain reason. So if we saw before, so if something dead, if you touch something dead, you were ceremonially unclean. And here, after birth, you are ceremonially unclean. Now, it looks like it has something to do with the blood. So not going into too many details about women having babies, but obviously there's bleeding and things after. There's healing that the woman has to do. And so with the son, she has 7 days that she's considered ceremonially unclean. And then she comes to the tabernacle, and she brings her son to the tabernacle. And at this time, her son gets circumcised. So if you remember all the way back in Genesis, circumcision is the covenant between, it's like the visual covenant between God's people and God. So God says, I gave you all these things, and now because I gave you all of these things, I want you to become circumcised. All of your males by the 8th day, I want them all to become circumcised. And Abraham, this was the covenant that he had with Abraham back in Genesis. So Abraham did it with his whole household, and now they're continuing that tradition, that law, that rule with God of circumcising the sons. And if it is a woman or if it is a daughter that has had, then it's 2 weeks, and then obviously they don't come back or they don't come back and circumcise. And so they need days for purification. And then after the purification, they bring a lamb for the offering, the woman, or they bring a bird for the sin offering, and they make atonement. So they make atonement for the woman that had the child, which I find really interesting because one would say it's a very natural thing. What would she need atonement for? She didn't do anything sinful that would need atonement, right? So it wouldn't need payment, because what did she do? She had a baby. So what did she do? I am thinking that it is something to do with the bleeding, because there's a very specific way in which the Lord treats blood and cleanliness and uncleanliness when it comes to that, and how he uses the sacrificial blood, right? We're not supposed to be, the Israelites are not supposed to be drinking any of the blood, right? They're not supposed to be eating any of the animals that are still alive with their blood. So there's something about the blood and the life force that that an atonement needs to be made. And I want to obviously be extremely clear, that does not make women unclean. That does not make women ultimately bad versus men. There's just an atoning process that needs to happen to remain holy in front of God, right? So again, this is very much about becoming holy and meeting with a holy God. So she comes to the entrance of the tabernacle, and she makes that atonement for giving birth, right? So there's that. So that's essentially chapter 12 in Leviticus. And then moving on to chapter 13 in Leviticus, this time it says, the Lord says to Moses and Aaron. So actually the Lord speaking to both of the brothers in this section, and they're talking about skin diseases. And so this is another area where I guess now in our modern time, we would probably see this as very strange, but this is about the idea of cleanliness versus uncleanliness in meeting with God and him meeting with his people. And so it's a huge section essentially about what skin disease looks like, right? Because he names several different ones, and there are different things for each different one. So if it looks a certain way, if it looks like, it doesn't have a white hair in it, right? There's all these different ways to look at it. They would go away for a short amount of time, but they're not considered unclean. And then they would come back and they would see the priest again. So every time they have some kind of skin disease, they're going to the priest. The priest is checking it out, looking to see if it's clean or unclean. And then they're essentially taking them away for a short period of time by themselves. And then they come back in, and then they'll ask the priest again, am I clean at this point? And if they are, then they would make an offering, right? And then they would be considered clean. If they are not, then they would have to go back again, right? So, and if it gets to a certain point, it's considered, the entire thing is considered unclean. So verse 9, they talk about a defiling disease. So if I go to that, and not every skin disease seems to be a defiling disease, but certain of them do, and the priest is able to tell that. When anyone has a defiling skin disease, they must be brought to the priest. And then the priest is to examine them and all of these things. And then the priest shall pronounce them unclean, but he's not isolating them because they're already unclean. So he's not isolating them with these type of skin diseases, because later we're going to say that they do. And then they come back and they do all these things. If it's white, then it's clean. So then moving on, I don't know if I want to go down this far to 45, but there are other ways that they talk about skin diseases, and some of them are defiling, and they are set out away from the rest of the people. So It seems like, and just even the thought of this. So what we do in verse 45, it says, anyone with such a defiling disease. So it has to do with their head and their scabs and all kinds of things going on. It says, anyone with such a defiling disease must wear torn clothes. So they're not supposed to wear their nicest of clothes, right? So I'm going to keep going. Must wear torn clothes, let their hair be unkempt. So these two things lead me to believe that the outside is supposed to represent the inside. And so you might be thinking, like, where am I getting that from? But they have to tear their clothes so they look disheveled and unkempt on the outside. Their hair is supposed to be a mess. They're supposed to look like they are not clean. And so there's a recognition among their people that this person is not clean, right? So just if we visually look at this person that has a defiling skin disease, we're going to look at them and go, something is wrong, right? Something is not right with them. Something is bad. Something bad is happening. They look dirty. They look unshowered. They look unkempt. And then on top of that, so there's just the outward appearance of them. And then on top of that, they cover the lower part of their face and they cry out, unclean, unclean. So I'm saying it like really calmly and casually. I don't think that would be what it was. It would be, again, they want people to know that they are unclean. And what that's going to do is that's going to keep people away from them, because they are unclean to the point where people can't be near them, whether it's because it's infectious, right? Or I don't know what else it could be, but there's a reason that God wants to keep them away. And it may not be, it may just be that he wants to separate them right now until this defiling disease is healed, and that person can then come be back with the rest of them. But as of right now, they are separated. They're shouting out that they're unclean, and they look on the outside like they're unclean. Now, I mention this because, or I mean, obviously it's in here, but to harp on it a little bit, we know that this, for those of us who have read in the future, we know that this continues, right? This continues for centuries, that this is the way that they behave. As a matter of fact, I'm going to say we know for it's at least 1,000 years, right? So it's probably longer than that, more like 1,500 years. So we know that they keep up with this tradition. I can imagine that this would be a mentally ostracizing position, right? Like, so our goal is to separate them only until they're clean and they can be brought back into the fold. But what if they never get clean? Then they're always on the outside, right? So I think this is a good thing to sort of think about and imagine as this people group, um, what some of them went through, right? And how they lived essentially apart from their people because of some of their diseases and their illnesses, right? So I don't think it was in hate or in anger or in frustration that they were kept apart, but God wanted to keep his people clean and holy. And so when there was a situation where that wasn't happening, they needed to separate themselves to not make the rest of the group dirty and unholy. As I say it, I can sit here and I can think to myself, wow, that makes a lot of sense, right? Like I think of I think of some of the TV that we watch now, right? Like I want my kids to, and of course, a couple of my kids are older, but I want my kids not to watch something that even has the littlest bit of dirty in it, because once they start to see that, it starts to breed unholiness. So there's this vision that where there are things that are unclean, it spreads and makes all the things around it unclean. So even when we move down a little bit further, it talks about moldy clothes, which would seem like such an abstract, like if you get mold on your clothes, you throw them away or you clean them off. And what they do is they actually separate them. So they separate these clothes for 7 days to see if the mold's going to spread or to see if it sort of dies where it is. And if it dies where it is, then you can move on and you can clean the clothes. But if it spreads, then you need to burn them. So it's not even that you need to just throw them away. You need to burn those clothes and obviously never wear them again. So there's this idea that unclean, because he really uses the word unclean, not the word dirty, but unclean spreads, and we want to be careful of that spread to the clean. We want to keep the clean clean, and we want to keep the unclean away from the clean so it doesn't infect it. So I can mentally look at that in a non-human way and say that makes perfect sense. In a human way, obviously, it is much more painful to think about, and probably devastating if you are, like, imagine you're a husband, imagine you're a father, and something makes you unclean. Imagine you're a mother and something makes you unclean, and you don't get clean. Whatever this disease is it keeps you away from other people, and it keeps you shouting unclean when anyone wants to come close to you. And so you're sort of set apart from the set apart, but in this way you're much more alone than anybody else. So it's tough. It's a tough thing to read, but again, I think God is setting us up, and he's setting his people up for the understanding of what is good and clean and what is not good and unclean. And sometimes things get hurt in that process. So I think it's a hard pill to swallow, but I always want to go back to Job and remember that in my human nature, I have a hard time understanding certain things that God sees very clearly. And he might mourn over certain things, but he also sees that the clean and the unclean need to be divided in order to keep the clean clean, right? So to keep the holy holy, he needs the wicked to be different and set apart from the holy. So again, I think it's much easier on inanimate objects than it is on human beings. So, but moving on to chapter 14. In chapter 14, this is verse 1. The Lord said to Moses. So now he's back talking to Moses. So he's talking about now regulations for. So it says, these are the regulations for any diseased person at the time of their ceremonial cleaning. So there's this time where they need a ceremonial cleaning. So they clean all their stuff, they clean all their people. And so he wants to, he's setting that apart. And the ceremonial and clean, right? We, during the cleaning, if you have a skin disease, you can't be cleaned, right? So you certainly don't want to be a part of that ceremonial cleaning. So they need something particular. So if I read verse 3, it here says the priest is to go outside the camp and examine them. So they can't even come in for the ceremonial cleaning. So the priest has to actually go out and examine them. If they have been healed of their defiling skin disease, they order all of these things. There's a whole bunch of things that they set up, and they order all those things to be sacrificed to be pronounced clean by the priests. So the priests even get to make a pronouncement on your cleanliness once you make all of those sacrifices that he asks for you to make. So it says, I want to read verse 7. It says, 7 times, back to that number, 7 times he shall sprinkle the one to be cleansed of the defiling disease. So he sprinkles them, he cleans them, and then they pronounce them clean. After that, he's to release the live birds in the open field. So once you're pronounced clean, then a live bird is released for you out into the field. And then I'm going to move on to 8. And then the person to be cleansed must wash their clothes, shave off all their hair, and bathe with water. Then they will be ceremonially clean. So here we go. You're going to go outside first, and then you get ceremonial clean. After this, they may come into the camp, but they got to stay outside the tent for 7 days. And then on the 7th day, they got to shave off all their hair, shave their head, their beard, their eyebrows, the rest of their hair, wash their clothes and bathe themselves, and then they will be clean. So we do this ceremonial cleaning first, this outward appearance, right? So what's inside matches what's outside. So we do what once they get this outward cleaning, because right now the internal is starting to be cleansed because they've done all the sacrificing. So they clean everything on the outside. Then they wait for a time, right? And then, right, so then 7 times, and then they have to do all this again, wash all this stuff off, and then they're clean on the inside, right? So then they're then pronounced clean, no longer ceremonially clean. They're pronounced clean. I'm going to read actually verse 11. I think this is the last one I'm going to read. The priest who pronounces them clean shall present both the one to be cleansed and their offerings before the Lord. So your offerings are going, and then God is presenting you as well. And then he's pronouncing you clean. And then in the rest of this chapter is essentially if you can't afford some of the bigger items here, God gives those who don't have a lot of money some cheaper options, in which I don't want to say it that way. If you can't afford it, God gives you some other options, some alternatives, which would still pronounce you clean and ceremonially clean. It will just be a way that you do it according to what you have to give. I feel like that makes it sound a little bit better. Anyway, so that is it for today. So that was going over a couple of things about cleanliness, and I'm sure we're going to do a little bit more of that as we move on, because we're kind of staying into these rules and laws based on the Levites and what the Levites have to do with the other people, do with the Israelites. So we're still in the book of Leviticus. I want you to keep reading and read with a partner. If you like this video, hit the like button, share it with other people, and subscribe to the channel so they keep coming to you. Until next time, keep reading.